actually got to solid conclusions, and we've been putting a lot more focused energy into moving it forward from conversation to action, and case studies, and so that's what we're hoping to talk more about today. Is there a way to share the screen? Thanks. Sweet. Mitigation on public lands. Okay, but I just wanted to start with the why. Why is this something that we keep talking about? Why are we talking about it at the banking conference? Just as a general kind of perspective, giving us some scale, and I think sometimes numbers can be deceiving, but sometimes numbers can tell a story pretty quickly. So in this case, just as one example of one type of public land, government, U.S. government, they own 47% of the land west of the Mississippi. Almost 50% of the western half of the United States is in federal ownership. That does not include state ownership, and that does not include local ownership. So that in and of itself is a huge number. And I stumbled into this topic as a restoration ecologist on a project where a private entity needed mitigation, and the most appropriate location to do mitigation in the watershed was on locally owned land. And rather than just moving downstream of it, we worked out a partnership with that landowner and are developing a bank on that area. And so that's where I really first dove into this. And the reason I have continued to really focus on it is that it's shocking how degraded a lot of our public lands are. So going to kind of the question of why, is this really needed? You know, we have government funding, right? All of these, local, federal, state, all have some form of budget associated with them. But is that adequate to manage the lands as they currently are? Is that adequate to manage the lands for what they could be? And the answer is no. There's not enough budget to manage them to what they're currently at, and if they're already in a degraded state, how do we ever improve them? So this idea of being able to tie private funds to public land, I think is really powerful. And when we talk about some of the bigger issues facing, the human population, I think public lands are part of that solution. And improving our public lands is a big part of that solution. So just some examples of the why. I always talk about, not every public land is Yosemite. And even if you go to Yosemite, Yosemite's not perfect. If you go to Yellowstone, Yellowstone is not perfect. They are beautiful, they are iconic, they make great postcards, but they also still need help and management, especially when you think of how much visitation has happened over how much visitation has continued to increase, and as our population increases, that just continues to compound things. So we have, but on much of our public land that is not used in that manner, we have other kinds of issues. We have past and present human uses, whether it's legal or illegal activities. Invasive pests and invasive plants are wreaking havoc in a lot of different ways throughout the country and the world. And then climate change is a big part of this. The stresses that are now going to be facing our natural areas and our public lands is greater than they've had to deal with in the human existence. And so how do we play a part in helping them be sustainable and adaptable and dynamic? And so one of the things that strikes me here is, we're talking about a homeless encampment versus, a massive hurricane. Like, these are huge scales. We're talking about, massive processes happening at massive scales. And so I think that further illustrates this conversation. We're talking about little local lands to across the whole country. I mean, we've got a big scale to work with. So I always ask in these sessions to just kind of, if people would be willing to accept that we're making the statement that it's needed and it's needed now. And rather than arguing about whether it's needed, it's more about how do we actually do it, and how do we do it in a way that is acceptable to people, addresses people's concerns, whether perceived or actual real hurdles. So just a kind of general statement that we've gone to is that public lands have limited, unreliable funding, need restoration and management, and solving these hurdles benefits the greater whole. And so I'm a big fan of the win-win-win-win relationship, and the longer I've been in this, the more I realize how many people win. The land manager wins, the project proponent or banker wins, the agencies win, the general public wins. And so this is really one of those things, like if you're looking for a feel-good thing, this is where bringing people together, that is never easy, but you have a lot to offer. There's a lot to offer in this conversation. I think everyone can get something out of this, and so I think there's a lot of opportunity for finding consensus within this topic. So wanted to just quickly remind everybody where we've gone from and where we're going to. So we've run working sessions for the last 3 conferences now. Last year was virtual. We ran one Monday and we ran one 2 years ago. And we've run those sessions with some pretty large groups of people. And one of the things, speaking of consensus, and the exercise was really to kind of drive to how do we move this forward? How do we move from talking about this to actually seeing an increase in this activity? And so from the work group or the workshop in 2019, we had 6 tables, and everybody kind of came to a general, similar kind of outline for what we think we should accomplish in the next 5 years. So starting with champions, creating a work group, moving into drafting some goals and a white paper, to really moving forward into more formal pilot programs and or identifying existing programs that represent pilot programs. And we're kind of living right now in the red circle, somewhere along the red triangle. I think that might be something from a movie. And we are continuing to look for people to help with this because, once again, we want to move it from talk to action, and we could use some help with the white paper. So the other thing we did officially, or we did check that box, is we started an official work group. I say official because everybody agreed to be part of it, and I think that's probably adequate to call it official, but I don't know if we need a stamp at some point. But it kicked off in 2021. We've had 2 work group calls in May and June, and then Monday we had a lot of folks from that working group that were participating, and then we're hoping to have at least 2 more this year. We have 3 levels of participation. We have kind of the active working group, people who will do writing, people who will track down resources, people who will really kind of be actively engaged. That's a small number of people. That's where we could probably use the most help. We have a stakeholder group. Who's going to read this before it goes out? Who's going to, just help provide feedback? That group. And then we have just the keep me updated. I'm interested in this topic. Tell me more as you guys keep doing things. So, and the right side of the screen here is basically a screenshot of the virtual whiteboard that we used where we were doing a lot of brainstorming around the white paper. So we've continued to kind of dive deeper into the conversation each time we have it. And for those of you that were here Monday, I hope you walked away with the idea of, okay, I feel this topic is advancing, rather than saying the same thing we said 2 years ago. I felt personally, we've moved past some of those conversations and are now really more focused on, let me show you an example, let me talk about the solution. So we're really excited for next steps. So what does that whoa, I didn't do it. Okay. What does that evolution of a path forward look like? So one of the biggest revelations, which is funny that it took so long to say it out loud, is that for-profit enterprise on public land is not new. But mitigation banking on public lands is pretty new, and it's really shrouded in perceptions, both real and false, as well as just a few unique hurdles that I think everybody can kind of agree on. But one of the most unique things is where most for-profit enterprises that happen on public lands are some form of extraction. And this is not extraction. This is ideally additional. It's bringing something, improving something, not just for the natural resources, but as we mentioned, for some of the other benefits. But kind of going back to the path forward, we're targeting a white paper, and we're targeting a white paper focused on federal lands, but with the idea that we want to still make it very usable by state and local entities, something that somebody can hold up and say, hey, look, I know you have a concern about A. Look, this white paper acknowledged that problem and has set forward some ideas about either why we can solve it or why it's not a real problem in the first place. We want people spending their efforts solving the real problems. So I'm excited today because both speakers are going to really be talking more about kind of solutions and path forward. So we have a regulatory kind of perspective from the Corps, like why can you do this within the Corps' context? Like why are you able to do this? And then we have a land manager, the Bureau of Land Management, and Devlin, who's going to talk about what they're doing as a federal land manager to invite people in to do this within their lands. And so as much as we're having this working group conversation, there are land managers out there actively also working to solve this within their own agencies. And so trying to kind of keep that synergy across those different groups and share what people are doing so that we're not recreating the wheels. And then I just put a bullet here. If you are interested in staying involved in the conversation or know somebody who is, just feel free to email me. You know, if it's just sharing your thoughts and perspectives and brainstorming, that's great. If you're willing to do some writing and research, all the better. But we're hoping to add more folks to the activities. So I'm going to start by introducing Devlin, who is going to be virtual with us. Sorry, I have multiple things happening. So I'm going to start by introducing Devlin Mead, who's amazing, who's our poltergeist in the room, who she lives above, and is going to be talking to us and presenting virtual. So she's the National Mitigation Lead for the Bureau of Land Management. She joined the BLM after 20 years with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She's been instrumental in developing compensatory mitigation at the field and national levels, and she's been engaged in this conversation certainly since I started participating, and just brings a wealth of knowledge. She's a resource that anybody should feel free to reach out to, and we're excited to have her. So Devlin, I am going to, the tech dudes are going to put you on, and then you could share your screen. Hi, Devlin.
Hey, good morning, everyone. And thanks, Lindsay, for the introduction and for that nice prelude to what we're doing today. So I'm having trouble sharing the screen. It says a host has disabled participant screen sharing. So if someone fixes that, I will get my slides up. And in the meantime, I have a question I want to ask the audience. Is audio okay?
Yeah, you're great. I was going to say, Devlin, if we can't fix it fast, I'll wait for a thumbs up or thumbs down. I can always share on this end, and you can just tell me when to advance, just so we have a backup plan.
Okay.
But audio is great. Well, you sound great.
I'm going to start with a question anyway to the audience. And so, Lindsay, maybe you can count the hands. So what I'm going to ask is, for those of you in the audience, how many of you have been involved with a compensatory mitigation project? Not just, it could be restoration, but really I'm really interested in a compensatory mitigation like restoration project sited on federally managed lands. So, BLM, Forest Service, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, refuges. So how many hands do we have up?
I have no clue if you can hear me. We have 9 hands, and we have a room, I haven't done an actual count, of about 40, so maybe 20%.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty good. So, all right, still unable to share my slides. Do you think that, Lindsay, when you share, did you unshare so I could share?
I think it's 2 totally different systems. Hold on, I need to figure out how to get my mouse back over here. I'm always making it go off.
Okay, well, I'll just start talking, and, and then hopefully the slides will catch up.
Well, and Devlin, I'm going to put your slides up because I have them here. So.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know if you can see our screen on your end.
Oh, you know what? You might have an old version.
True.
All right, well, we'll just see. I really hope they can get it fixed because I made some changes. Like a lot of changes. Okay, you want to hang on 60 seconds, and I'm just going to ask out loud if they think they can fix it? Okay.
We don't know about the Zoom thing? Okay, I know we had that happen on Monday too. Yeah. Okay, cool.
And I can start before, I can get a little bit of preview before. Sounds
good.
So here's the, so when my talk does pop up, you're going to see, here we go. I think I can,
Nice. It's working.
Look good?
Yeah, it's great.
Yay. Okay. So you'll notice the title here, meeting public land restoration and mitigation market needs, is different than what's on the abstract of your program, but the content is still in keeping with what's in the abstract. So I want to start by kind of focusing on three main areas. And the first is identifying resources on BLM managed lands. And I am going to speak from a BLM perspective since that's the agency I'm with. But some of it will go across federal lands. But start by identifying resources on BLM managed lands that are in need of restoration. And then next, focusing on protective land use designations. So I want to provide some general information on where to cite compensatory mitigation projects to maximize durability when you're looking at doing your project on federal lands. And then last, just talk a little bit about mitigation market needs. And mostly I just want to make you aware that BLM policy supports mitigation markets. And it's kind of at this intersection that you really see these compensatory mitigation opportunities. And I'm really happy to see that, almost a quarter of the audience has done some kind of mitigation project on federal land. So that was great. All right. So that first bubble, what you really want to do is focus your resources, focus on the resources determined to be important, sensitive, scarce, and those protected by law. And, streams and wetlands that are protected under the Clean Water Act, federally listed, endangered, or threatened species are the ones that come to mind, and the ones that have probably most been the focus of some of these compensatory restoration projects, compensatory mitigation and restoration projects. But BLM, through our authorities, primarily FLPMA, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, we have authority to also require mitigation for other important resources, important species and habitats. So, one of the things that really pops up is greater sage-grouse. It's been a huge issue for the last 5 to 10 years. And, sagebrush habitat or the sagebrush biome, migration corridors for big game, also a big issue for BLM managed lands, on BLM managed lands. So not just limiting to the things that mitigation markets have mostly been focused on in the past. And then also consider state mitigation needs, even if they're not quite the same as the federal needs. BLM works very closely with states on whatever mitigation programs or priorities there are. We often do MOAs, MOUs with states to try and get in sync on what we're going to do with programs. And then Department of the Interior priorities. America the Beautiful plan goals, also referred to as 30 by 30 plan goals. And so a couple of those goals are restoring landscape connectivity and function, conserving and restoring lands to combat climate change, improving water resources, and restoring legacy disturbances. And those are all goals where compensatory mitigation projects can play a role. Okay, so this is now moving to that kind of second bubble on protective land use designations. So focus on formal land use designations such as ACECs, areas of critical environmental concern, and units of conservation, national conservation lands, or kind of those other formal designations, some of which are you can see in the green box there. But also focus on general geographic areas with maybe informal designations or restrictions on use. So areas that would still be compatible with a compensatory mitigation project cited there. No surface occupancy, limitations on the amount of disturbance, established protection measures. And you're going to find those both formal and informal land use designations in land use plans, resource management plans, mitigation strategies where we have them. And then the last thing, is, looking at existing conservation and restoration strategies that are already in place, not necessarily focused on mitigation, but just, those are the areas that need work. So there's, in the green box at the bottom, there's a link. And so I want to introduce you to our BLM Landscape Approach Data Portal. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that, but when you get to this page, you want to click on that tab, BLM National Data. Then you want to scroll all the way down to the bottom of the screen and click on Launch Full Feature Map. And that will take you to an interactive map with a menu, a layer list on the right. And you can choose from a number of different layers that you can turn on and off. And so I have a couple examples here. And so this example, I've gone ahead and turned on the land use planning boundaries map layer. And I've gone ahead and clicked on within one of those areas. You can see where the red arrow is, and it's going to give you a pop-up box with the name of that land use planning area and some other information. And then another example here, I've gone ahead and clicked on, or I've opened the layer for areas of critical environmental concern, ACECs, and clicked again in one of those areas, and it'll give you the name of the area and some more information. And you can zoom way in, you can get a lot of detail here. And, there are layers for national conservation lands, wilderness areas, wild and scenic rivers, but there are also some other useful layers. So you can see what's going on the landscape, things like grazing allotments and oil and gas active leases. So it's really a good resource when you're thinking about where you might cite compensatory mitigation projects. So it's a starting point. Obviously, you're going to want to go and talk to folks in that area in the BLM office, whether that's a state district or a field office. Okay, and a little bit more on durability of public lands while we're on this topic of protective land use. And what's the same and what's different when you're citing one of these compensatory mitigation projects on private land or public land? And, management, resource assurances, both short and long-term management, stewardship, and also financial assurances, that is all the same. Really want to see the same package that would come through for a bank or an NEPA program, or a single restoration project that you would submit for something occurring on private lands. What's different is on private lands, you're probably going to be using a conservation easement, whereas on BLM managed lands, if we're doing the project in advance and not connected to any development project or other land use authorization at the same time, then we can do a long-term lease that essentially has a lot of the same elements of a conservation easement. We just can't guarantee perpetuity because of our multiple use and sustained yield mission, but we can actually provide a lot of protection in the long term for that site. Or there may be some other instrument, that we're using based on the situation. Okay, so kind of getting to that third bubble, market needs, and thinking about demand and supply. And I just want to make clear that BLM policy does encourage and support considering mitigation well in advance of making decisions about anticipated public land uses. And we do that through identifying opportunities in land use plans, resource management plans, mitigation strategies, and also these sort of programmatic or really large geographic scale NEPA analyses that kind of serve as kind of an umbrella over step down projects and NEPA analyses. And then also, you know, mitigation policy supports, well, policy supports, I'll give you a disclaimer in a minute, but BLM policy supports development and use of mitigation banks, exchanges, and fee programs, and the use of mitigation funds, of which there are several that we've been using for tortoise, desert tortoise, and some other resources and species. So that said, I do want to say that we are kind of in a transition period right now. Recently, just in the last about week or so, the BLM rescinded the compensatory mitigation policy that came out under the last administration, but we haven't quite yet put back in place our new policy or you know, replacement policy. So we're kind of in that little bit of a limbo area right now, that transition area. But we hope to get that out soon, and when we do, it will be on our, you know, I'll make sure you get that, and it'll be on our website. So we continue to see almost all project proponents, no matter the size of the project, you know, whatever they're trying to do on public land use authorization that will require compensatory mitigation. We continue to see those folks really prefer to purchase mitigation credits if those are available, or to write a check and let someone else deal with, you know, finding, developing, implementing a compensatory mitigation project. So there's still this market need out there. We just don't see a lot of advanced kind of mitigation occurring, mitigation in advance of impacts on public lands. And that's really the way to go. I'm a big fan of the banking model. So last year at this conference, I gave a presentation that talked about more in detail about how these long-term leases work. So I'm not going to talk about that here, but I just wanted to pop up a slide here with some of the authorities so you could see that, you know, this is very, very feasible. And we are doing a couple of, we're in the works on a couple of these right now. I think you heard about one of them at this conference through the South Dakota DOT. That one is what we're calling an aquatic habitat restoration lease. We can also do these on arid lands. It does not have to be limited to, you know, wetlands or streams. And so this is not new. This type of lease has been in regulations for a long time, and it's for commercial purposes. Restoration projects developed by mitigation sponsors to generate credits are a commercial purpose. And those credits obviously belong to the mitigation sponsor, not to BLM. But of course, their use is going to be regulated by whatever agency or agencies are responsible for approving those credits and approving the use of those credits. So in this case, with our South Dakota DOT, it'll be the Corps for the most part. I'm not sure, there may be also a state agency that weighs in, but it'll be the Corps that determines whether or not the use of those credits is appropriate for any projects in the future, any development projects that happen in the future. So with that, I just want to say that, you know, we will have policy out hopefully soon. It will probably be in the form of manual section and handbook, which is what we had before, which was rescinded during the last administration. But we'll see where that goes. And then we will have a specific public-facing BLM mitigation webpage. We haven't had one of those for a long time, but that will be coming soon. As soon as we get policy, we'll get that page up and some other tools and useful information on there. And then you can contact me at any time. My contact information is in the program materials. And I can put you in touch with mitigation leads. We have a mitigation lead in each of our BLM state offices. And really, you're going to probably focus your efforts on the West. The 11 Western states where we have offices are where most of the compensatory mitigation opportunities exist on BLM managed lands. And then some helpful websites, obviously, are just our homepage, e-planning, which I mentioned land use plans and resource management plans a number of times. You can go to e-planning and you can download, you can get a lot of information on really anything we've done, the plans, also projects, all the EISs, a lot of the EAs and decision documents are all loaded on e-planning, and you can download those. And then, of course, that landscape approach data portal that I shared with you, which is worth exploring. So with that, I thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions during the Q&A period.
Thank you so much, Devlin. We're going to save questions to the end because I think it might be nice to have both people potentially respond. So Devlin, you'll hang on through David's presentation?
Yep, I'll be here.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Okay, I'm going to magically pull up. Okay, well, I hope everybody enjoyed Devlin's presentation. I always appreciate her perspective because it's just very, in some ways, simple. Like, we do this, you can do this, call me, we will make this happen. It is not the hurdles, we have to clear lots of things. It's a very straightforward, path. And so she's a great resource, and I hope you guys will ask some questions, but also consider reaching out to her. So our next speaker is David Olson, the Regulatory Program Manager from the Army Corps of Engineers, and been with the Army Corps since 1991 and been at his current position in headquarters since 2003. And his focus currently includes the nationwide permit program, Endangered Species Act compliance with the Department of Army, ecosystem rehabilitation, and then just cumulative impact analysis. So we're really happy to have David here to speak from the Corps' perspective on this topic, because as Devlin mentioned, the other side of that coin is we have the mitigation, and there will also be the permitting process, both for the applicants and the proponents of the banks. So welcome, David.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, and it's great to be able to speak at this conference. I was asked to give a presentation on how the Corps' 2008 mitigation rule might be applied to mitigation projects on public lands, with an emphasis on flexibility that's built into the rule that can be used to help come up with approaches that can help address some resource needs, whether they're on public or private land, because we do recognize that a lot of these public land management agencies often don't get the resources they need to do the restorative actions on their property that they would like to do. So there may be opportunities for mitigation providers to do some of these actions on their property as for mitigation. So I kind of like to start with a basic background. Compensatory mitigation, I'm sure you're all familiar with, but it's basically offsets to address environmental losses that occur as a result of activities authorized by Corps permits. And there are four basic approaches to compensatory mitigation, which is restoration, enhancement, establishment, and preservation. But the two key principles I'm going to kind of refer to throughout my talk are functions and services. Because functions are the physical, chemical, and biological processes that occur in ecosystems, and they are sort of the target for these compensatory mitigation actions. We seek to improve these functions on these sites, but related to the functions are the services that are performed as a result of those functions. And I think ecosystem services are going to get a lot more interest in the coming years, especially with this administration's emphasis on environmental justice and helping to helping to improve things for underserved communities. So I like to kind of start by talking about what are ecosystems services. And everyone, when you talk about ecosystem service, seems to go back to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that was done in 2005, where it identified 4 categories of ecosystem services, which are provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and supporting services. So you see various examples of provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services. And some of these cultural services, such as recreation, aesthetics, education, I mean, they may be very important for communities that live near these resources, and also for people to visit these public lands. So the services help provide human well-being and poverty reduction, help with living a good life, having a healthy life, security, good social relations, and things like that. So I think a lot of people focus on functions, but the mitigation rule, when we wrote it back in 2008, put also an emphasis on these services because they are also important, especially when it comes to siting compensatory mitigation projects, and thinking about the benefits of these compensatory mitigation projects. So under the rule, it states that compensatory mitigation projects can be sited on public or private lands. However, if they are done on public lands, then any compensatory mitigation credits must be generated by activities that supplement those existing programs. In other words, there has to be some additionality, as people like to refer it. The mitigation rule also emphasizes the use of a watershed approach, and there may be opportunities on public lands that may be restorative actions that could be done to help improve the ecological functioning of the watershed. So there's a lot of different ways that public lands can fit into compensatory mitigation decision-making for core permits. And the regulation, gets a little bit more detailed by stating that credits for compensatory mitigation public lands must be based on solely on aquatic functions over and above those that are already provided by those existing public programs. There may be public land management agencies that have identified priority areas for aquatic restoration or enhancement efforts, and these can be federal agencies, tribal agencies, state, local governments. And they may not have funding to carry out these projects, even though they've identified them up front. So there may be opportunities for mitigation providers to step in with some funding and the ability to do this work and get it accomplished. And then it could be part of the land after it meets its ecological success criteria and gets signed off by the Corps as fulfilling the compensatory mitigation requirements. So these can be mitigation banks, they could be in lieu fee projects, or permanently responsible mitigation. The regulation also addresses site protection, and again, there's a lot of flexibility in how site protection is addressed. But you kind of have to look for the key words in the regulation. So the rule talks about how the aquatic habitat, riparian areas, buffers, and uplands that comprise the overall compensatory mitigation project must be provided with long-term protection as appropriate. Now, there's a lot of as appropriates in these regulations. They might throw in the term practicable. So that really gives people flexibility in finding what's the best solution in a particular situation in terms of what can be done in terms of site protection. Some site protection may be your traditional real estate instruments like conservation easements, fee and simple, basically paying for the land too. I can't remember what, I'm not a real estate expert, so I don't really know, but deed restrictions, things like that. For government property, it may not be possible to put conservation easements or deed restrictions on that property. So there may be federal facility management plans, integrated natural resource management plans that may be used to provide some degree of protection to those sites. The 2008 rule does not define what long-term is, and it, by intent, does not say the word perpetuity, but it does say long-term, but it doesn't say how long it is, because one of the reasons why there's some ambiguity in this regulation is that real estate laws vary by state by state. The federal government really doesn't have an overall real estate law that would make sense to apply to this rule, so we kind of rely on what states, what tribal lands might have, what local governments may have in terms of how they can allow site protection in lands within their geographic boundaries. Site protection might not be feasible for some public lands, and this is especially true in submerged lands in estuaries and marine waters, because they're technically owned by the state in most cases. Now, there's some states where private individuals can own subtidal lands, but for the most part, they do fall under the state. So someone can't, someone's restoring seagrass, they can't put a conservation on the seagrass. So that, there has to be other ways of protection, or there may not be any way to protect it at all. Also, in terms of site protection, once the compensatory mitigation project has achieved its objectives and the Corps signs off on it, they could be transferred to a public land management agency. This could be a transfer of title from the responsible party to that land management agency. And some land management agencies might find this enticing because they can add to their portfolio of lands that they manage and have different types of access to the public or for other different purposes. And we'll get into sort of compatible uses, incompatible uses a little bit later. But when compensatory mitigation projects are undertaken on public lands, there should be a written agreement between the Corps and that land management agency to stipulate what the provisions of that compensatory mitigation project are, needing to set clear expectations and roles and responsibilities. And then if for some reason that land has to be used for another purpose, then what potential actions might be taken to address future incompatible uses that might come from that change in use. So incompatible uses versus incompatible uses is an important consideration when you look at site protection, what can be allowed on a compensatory mitigation project. The regulations states that site protection mechanisms must prohibit incompatible uses that might jeopardize the objectives of the compensatory mitigation projects, but it leaves a lot of flexibility to decide what those incompatible uses versus compatible uses are. Now, there may be compatible uses like fishing or grazing that may be allowed on a compensatory mitigation project site. Now, if it's grazing, it's often certain types of grazing. It's sort of like low impact grazing, not a full-fledged large herd of cows or anything like that on there. But, again, it has to allow the compensatory mitigation project to function as it was intended to function. There may also be some subsistence activities that may occur on these compensatory mitigation projects, especially on public lands or tribal lands, such as growing medicinal herbs that are important to the tribe, or growing different types of food that grow in the wild that are used by certain communities. But in terms of compatible uses, you can also think about fishing. In addition to fishing and grazing, what about low impact recreation like trails and boardwalks? Because some public access to these sites might be important because, again, for those services component where they have educational value, they also have aesthetic value. Especially as we're emerging from this pandemic, when people were locked in their houses for weeks on end, they wanted to get out and see some nature, and there were a lot of doctors who were advising go out and see some nature. It might help settle your mind a little bit. So having some public access might be important as long as, again, as it's not jeopardizing the functions and services being provided by that compensatory mitigation project. And then, if that public land management agency needs to change the use of that land for either a statutory reason or other reason, then the public agency is responsible for providing alternative compensation to address the change in use, or more specifically the incompatible use. And they may have to do some sort of restoration project somewhere else to help offset that whatever is lost as a result of that change in use. But this should all be laid out up front in that written agreement between the Corps and the land management agency. But there's a lot of flexibility in how you address that. So sort of build on what Lindsay was talking about earlier, some potential considerations for identifying compatible uses. It's important, I think, to look at these landscapes where people live, where ecosystems are, and the fact that people are part of these ecosystems. One term of art that's being used more often when you think about resiliency are social ecological systems, which are linked systems comprised of people and nature. In other words, people and nature are intimately linked. They're not separate from each other. And I think that's important because if people understand the importance of nature in providing functions and services that help with their well-being, they're going to do more to protect those resources. And also it's important to remember that we live in a lot of cultural ecosystems, and these are ecosystems that have developed under the joint influence of natural processes and human activities. They have a structure, composition, functionality. Yes, so they're being used by people, but again, they're also being used by other species as well. And then when you sort of look globally, human activities have directly affected more than 70% of the global ice-free land surface. So I know people like to talk about pristine systems, but if you look around, they're really hard to find. So most ecosystems have been changed by humans over the past 15,000 years or so. So there really is no such thing as a pristine system. So you're kind of, again, looking at these social ecological systems when you think about compatible land uses and the fact that people have lived in these areas for many, many, many years. And these public lands, they're not supposed to be generally thought to be separate. They're not isolated museum pieces, in other words, but, they affect people, and they're very important to a lot of people. So the people component needs to be considered, especially if we're going to look at environmental justice in underserved communities. So with respect to long-term management for compensatory mitigation projects, the regulation talks about how the Corps has to identify the party responsible for ownership and long-term management of compensatory mitigation projects, and that those long-term management responsibilities may be transferred to a land stewardship entity, which can be a public agency, a non-governmental organization, or a private land manager. Now, the rule doesn't really say what's required for long-term management, and that's by design. Long-term management might simply consist of ensuring that the site protection mechanism is sustained. In other words, that incompatible uses are not being undertaken on these compensatory mitigation projects, so that they can continue to provide their intended ecological functions and services. Compensatory mitigation projects are supposed to be self-sustaining. They shouldn't require a lot of management. They shouldn't include a lot of engineered structures that need maintenance. But there may be some that do. But long-term management can be relatively hands-off, and again, focusing on that site protection mechanism. It also could include other things. But the important thing is that there's a long-term ability to provide those ecological functions and services, and that may depend on local support, because if the local community values the functions and services provided by that compensatory mitigation project, they're going to take care of it. And if someone's doing something in that site that is adversely affecting it, they may notify the appropriate agency to address it. So, again, these are part of the community and should be considered as such. So some other considerations when you look at compensatory mitigation public lands is that public lands, can provide a variety of functions and services for people and other species, and they may have areas that have been impacted in the past and they need to be restored. And compensatory mitigation projects can be an opportunity to restore those when the public land agency doesn't have that funding or other resources that are necessary to carry out those actions. There may be a broad range of restoration actions that can address present and future environmental challenges. In other words, we need to kind of look at the future. We live in a rapidly changing environment. So what are those resource needs going to be in the immediate and maybe the far future? There may be responsible combinations of use and non-use in these cultural ecosystems that consist in these compensatory mitigation projects. Again, trying to think about what are compatible uses versus incompatible uses. And then it's also, when you think about additionality, it's important to identify that management baseline so that you can decide whether or not that additionality is being provided that can be used as an offset for a Section 404 permit issued by the Corps. So some summary points. Again, compensatory mitigation projects may be located on public or private lands, and they must provide that additionality. Consider how compensatory mitigation projects on public lands can provide ecosystem services. And then the rule does have a lot of flexibility in terms of how site protection, long-term management approaches are undertaken for these types of projects. And with that, I will end. Thank you.
Okay, hopefully we'll bring Devlin back on the screen, and would love to take your questions. I think we have some roaming mics, or a roaming mic. So if you have a question for either presenter, for all the presenters, please raise your hand.
So regarding long-term management, so if a public agency is the long-term steward, how do we, are there any mechanisms or practices in place to ensure when we fund for long-term management, we're not, subsidizing long-term management activities with taxpayer dollars?
Well, I mean, that depends on where the source of that funding comes from, because normally if it's a mitigation provider, I mean, they would have to establish a funding mechanism. But they're also, it depends on what the long-term management requirements are. If it's to ensure that the site is not being used for incompatible purposes, I mean, that may be covered by the funds and the due diligence that agency does anyway as part of its day-to-day job, and that's why they may take it as part of their portfolio so they can undertake those responsibilities. So that, if it becomes part of their lands, then, essentially, the taxpayer isn't really paying for anything extra other than what that public agency was funded to do in the first place. But again, a lot of these details, I think, would need to be worked out on a case-by-case basis by the core district and in that agreement with the public land agency. But if, to me, it's like if the land management agency wants to take on that land, then it's going to have obligations to do that. So how it fulfills those obligations is really up to them, because the Corps is not going to dictate how it spends its money.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, just more from a specific example, that I know of one project where it's sited on local public lands. It's within an existing preserve system, but the preserve system was generated for upland and species restoration or management, not aquatic resources. So when we're working on developing the long-term management plan and the funding, we first look at exactly as David just said, what are they already funded to do? So they're funded to do annual reporting, some things that there's already some small natural efficiencies there. But as far as the actual work, the monitoring, potential supplemental invasive species monitoring, all of that gets funded by the project proponent. And depending on the entity and how finances can exchange hands, which we've had a variety of conversations depending on the landowner. In this case, it'll be an endowment that goes to fund their preserve manager with a specific kind of line item for that property and or this project, and the project will probably become a standalone chapter in their monitoring report. So where we can, we try to divide a little line, but also acknowledging that once that the banking proponent steps away, the landowner and that manager do take responsibility. So really, it's very similar to what happens with a traditional bank, making sure it's funded properly, and that it's funded by the proponent. So, Devlin, did you have anything to add? Yep.
I do. I want to add a little something to that. So I think that's a really good question. And I think right at the start, you really need to spell out the roles and responsibilities and who funds what right up front. And, in the long-term management plan, in a lease or other instrument, whatever it is that, the whole package, it really needs to be carefully thought out, who's responsible for what, how it's going to be funded. And there still will be, from BLM, you're still probably going to have an endowment sitting with some, appropriate and qualified third party that will do some oversight throughout the term of the lease. And these leases have a right to renew. So if we need to renew them longer, let's say it's for 20 years and you need to go for another 20 years or whatever, that funding will be there. But eventually, like Dave was saying, you really want that site to function on its own under the normal management regime for that public agency. So long-term, not necessarily in perpetuity, but not subsidized in any way. And you really want to be careful on the subsidizing kind of issue at the start, that there isn't already, or there isn't expected to be money coming from Congress to do some of that work on that site before we enter into a compensatory mitigation project agreement.
Thank you for the presentations. Some years ago in the eastern part of the U.S., we tried to talk to the U.S. Forest Service about this. It sounds like BLM is developing good internal guidance to the BLM on how this can happen. But at the time we spoke to the Forest Service, they said, well, we'll have to start from scratch and figure out what this lease would look like. Do you know if other agencies are doing the same work BLM is doing to come up with internal guidance, or if the BLM guidance might be useful across agencies that deal in public land management?
I would like to introduce you to Jonas Epstein from the Forest Service, who's been working really hard on this. And so at least a few entities most definitely are doing this. But this kind of maybe goes back to some of the working group conversation, which is trying to understand who is doing it and seeing where we can find templates and make things that others can build from. So, and actually Kevin Noon, who couldn't join us today from the National Park Service, is also working on things within his organization, is working on a variety of items within his organization. So yeah, there's some good momentum.
Lindsay?
Yeah, go on, Devlin.
Yeah, I just want to make clear that, all of the public agencies work under different laws and authorities. And so BLM under FLTMA has this ability to do these easements, leases, and permits. The easement actually isn't the right tool for this. The lease is really more comparable to a conservation easement on private land. But Jonah's there and he can speak to that. Forest Service has they're working under a whole different set of a different law and different set of authorities. So they're not going to be able to do a lease, but they can do other things.
Awesome. I saw a few other hands.
Yeah.
There we go.
Hey, Devlin, it's Wayne Walker. Hope you're doing well. Thanks for being on the panel and everybody putting the panel together today. So, look, I haven't been in the middle of this public lands thing. Y'all have been living it for, I guess, 3 years now. And I don't operate in the West. I'm in the Southern Plains. I'm a conservation mitigation banker. But I've seen situations that are really ugly where you've got a mitigation or conservation banker who's invested with a private land partner or purchased the land, had it approved by, whether it's Fish or Army Corps, and, a public land option, whether it be state land or federal land, has been used to basically undermine the market to keep, the private sector investment off the field, so to speak. So I guess my questions are, first, how do we rationalize that doing mitigation on public lands is not just going to, subsidize, to your point, Devlin, the cost of development at the expense of a private sector investment who has a private landowner rancher partner, for say, in the West? And specifically, in the BLM policy, are you going to state a preference for using private sector, banks or whatever the mitigation solution is, inland fees, whatever, on private land, so that we don't have this dynamic where the public land with a lower cost basis is undermining these private sector investments?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Wayne, that's a question that's come up, or issue that's come up in the past quite a number of times. And BLM really doesn't have the authority to limit where a project proponent is going to mitigate, unless, the development project is on BLM land. And our first preference is that you do the most ecologically appropriate, the most ecologically appropriate site for the resources and the functions, the stuff that you're trying to mitigate for, But we also have a preference for, if the impacts occurred on BLM managed lands, we really do want, if it's ecologically preferable, that compensatory mitigation to occur on BLM managed lands. So, but we don't really have the authority to dictate where someone goes. And in the case of a project that's not occurring on our lands, it's going to be whoever the entity is that has jurisdiction over those resources. Like, let's say it's, a wetland or stream credits, it's going to be the Corps of Engineers that, provides, the options for where that person, that project proponent can go to mitigate. So I think what it comes down to is on the market side, on your side, carefully thinking about what the market needs, where it's going to be most advantageous for you to site a compensatory mitigation project, and also working directly with those project proponents that really need those credits. And we have a lot of large projects that occur on, BLM and Forest Service lands, and a lot of linear projects, pipelines, transmission lines, things that cross states, and also that are going to have multiple mitigation sites within there. So perhaps setting up some kind of umbrella type, banking like project would work. But I think from your experience that there's limitations on, what we can, where we can set boundaries on where people mitigate and what credits they buy.
And I just wanted to add to that, because I think that perspective is really important, Wade, what you shared. And we've really tried to keep this conversation broad and ideally inclusive of bankers and for-profit bankers, and would love to invite you to, to participate in the conversation about what do the guidelines look like, where BLM can't make that kind of a statement. Can and should the white paper make something like that? Is that the statement that should be made? At the end of the day, everything we're talking about involves human beings, and unfortunately, there are human beings that will always work outside of what might feel ethically good. And so I don't know, I know that we won't be able to mitigate every weird situation that could happen out there, but I'd like to think that if we're all working toward the same objective, making sure that private dollars can get to public lands, and that the business models that bankers and other for-profit entities operate under is sustainable, and that this is ideally an added opportunity for bankers. I'm hoping there's a path forward, but I don't know that we've completely solved that, and I don't know that I know we don't want to dismiss it as not something that needs to be talked about. So we've had a few bankers participate on the stakeholder group, but not as many as I would like to see. And so so I'll just leave that at that. But it's a real concern, and how we address it. We would love more perspective on that. And Michelle.
I just had a follow-up question to that. It sounded like, I just wanted to verify that doing work on public lands is not necessarily free.
Correct.
Outside
Yes.
of long-term management and the other things, it's not free. You still have to pay a fee for the lease and so on, right? Is that right, Devlin?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It's not free. So, obviously if you're going to put a conservation easement on, private land, you're going to end up paying the landowner. So same thing happens with BLM managed lands. Under regulation, you're required to pay fair market value rent for as long as you have the lease on that site. And it may end up being less expensive than doing the same project on private lands, just across the border, the public-private land border. But there's still going to be cost, and there may be what we call cost recovery if the BLM is doing work. Oh, and I should say that rent money goes directly to the Treasury. It does not go to BLM. And then there may be cost recovery expenses if BLM is doing the NEPA work and whatever else it is. There, people hours that occur to get your project, up, to the finish line. So there, you'd have to do you know, a cost analysis, cost benefit analysis, and see where that lands. It's not something, it's definitely going to be case by case, but it's not free.
Yeah.
And thanks for bringing that up, Michelle.
Yeah, and I think, you know, using the BLM's example and the examples of other entities that are doing some type of fair market, you know, compensation for the land. The local landowner that I have mentioned, land manager, did a, you know, fair market cost evaluation, and in this case, rather than paying a lease, the proponent is funding trail installation up to the dollar value associated with that land. And so once again, going back to this concept of white papers, providing options to people, because there are going to be entities that don't have as much organization behind them as the Forest Service or BLM, and we want to be able to provide them a variety of examples. Like if this doesn't work, if a rent doesn't work for you, or a lease value, or you know, some way of kind of offsetting that compensation. But I think that's really an important piece, and that's one of the biggest potentially perceived hurdles is this concept of making money on public land. You know, that you're and so that offsetting that base value of the land, I think, is really an important piece, and hopefully also helps kind of level the playing field in many ways. It may or may not always. We were talking last night at after hours about this, and I was asking, we were talking specifically about this, and I was asking, you know, how often is it that there's a private and a public landowner sitting right next to each other, and that situation that you were describing, Wade, comes up? And I'm not saying it doesn't come up a lot, but I'm wondering, you know, if we have to describe certain situations and provide what a solution might look like under that circumstance, because I would hope that just like private land, if somebody's paying attention to the market in that area, what we're wanting to do is open people's eyes to the idea of, like, you can look at private land, because if you can find a private landowner, that's great, but not to stop looking once you hit that public land border, that bankers, that everybody could be looking at a broader suite, starting with the watershed analysis. Someone from Southern California, the bulk of our headwaters live in some form of public land ownership. It's just the way our topography has lended itself to development and land preservation. And so we often, you know, you go to the top of the watershed, but most people just immediately then move down. You know, you start there and then you go to where's the line where the private land is, and you start looking there. And we'd really like to kind of continue to use that watershed approach.
Thing to look into, and because, you know, the market dynamics, I don't understand, like, how BLM prices their rentals, and, you know, someday I'll have time to figure that out. But if it is materially cheaper, or even cheaper than the scenario you talked about, Lindsay, you know, you're putting ranches that could be partnering with us to be conserved at risk for subdivision. And I think we all know, if, you know, I don't have any investments in the West, but I spend a lot of time, you know, vacay out there and stuff, and look, it's a problem. Like, we're losing a lot of land to development of these rural landscapes. My question is, so Devlin, I've heard that that BLM has, in one particular state, has actually moved from partnering with folks like us to do mitigation to actually sponsoring the mitigation internally. And I was wondering if you could speak to that, and if that's true, that's very disconcerting, and hopefully that's something your policy can correct, and we can maintain a partnership versus a competitor situation.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that. Maybe it's better if we talk offline, if, you know, what state that is. I mean, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure what you're talking about there, Wayne. But I can say that, you know, BLM does have the authority to collect mitigation funds and either contract out or do the work ourselves. But that doesn't happen in like a banking type situation, you know, mitigation in advance of impacts kind of thing. It happens because that was the project. You know, that's what the project proponent ended up doing. I think a lot of these project proponents, if they could just, you know, not write a check to BLM, but write a check and buy credits and feel like that's the end of it, they're no longer responsible or liable for the success of that mitigation, and no one's going to come back and ask for any more money, that would be preferable for them. But we should talk. Just give me a call later, because I don't know what state you're talking about or what that situation is.
So I am very happy to have heard this conversation keep going over the past few years. As a regulator, we're often, we get a project with mitigation already kind of proposed with that project application. And we see a lot of, mining, large solar projects, wind, geothermal. And I'm just wondering what, other than kind of being here talking to the industry, what other steps can federal agencies take to identify potential properties for restoration, or, is there being the effort put out to put comments out on like early scoping for NEPA? Kind of where can the federal agencies get involved to make it kind of clear, hey, we have this property that can be restored? Because I think by the time it gets to the regulators, it's well past that point of being able to point out like some properties, especially, when we're talking about the very large mining projects that might be on BLM property or near BLM, or Forest Service, or, any of the various land management agencies.
Right. That kind of sounds like it might be directed at me and maybe Jonas in the audience there, but I think you have to keep up with what's going on in the area that you're interested in, and make sure that get those notices. I think you can get notices through e-planning on what's happening, but definitely these are public there's a public process. There are oftentimes, especially for the large projects, public meetings, things like that, and you're going to have to be involved with those early on to see what's going on. And I think that's the best way. You really just need to get in there early and know what's happening before you see. You don't want to get in at the point where there's a decision document. You want to get in early during the NEPA process. And the other thing to look at is going forward. We hopefully we are going to have a lot more what we call mitigation strategies. And these can be either an appendix to a land use plan or a resource management plan, or they can be, a standalone mitigation strategy for even a larger region that reaches, outside, or includes several plan areas. But those are good places to look too for opportunities on what the mitigation is. But again, those are also, those larger ones are going to be public process. There's going to be a public process there. So you want to get in and be part of that conversation early on, and just kind of get a feel for what the market's going to need, what's on the, going to be on the demand side, so you can be ahead of that. But that's something we'll work more on, and we'll try to get, it may take a couple years, but we'll try to get some more guidance, and even hopefully some pilot projects out there that'll help, bankers, mitigation sponsors in the future, kind of have an easier path toward identifying where the opportunities are.
And if I could add to that, I mean, there's over the past, I don't know, 10, 15 years. I mean, there's been work on tools, especially sort of like GIS-based tools. And what I'd like to point out is EPA, the Corps, and various state agencies in the Mid-Atlantic region developed what's called a watershed resources registry. And basically, it's a GIS tool that looks at various watersheds in the area. It looks for opportunities for stream restoration, wetland restoration, riparian area restoration, and also has data layers on the various types of land ownership and things like that. But that was a tool developed to help find those opportunities at a watershed scale of where these resource needs are. And I'm sure there's other types of efforts that are similar to that, but that watershed resources registry really was a powerful tool in helping mitigation providers and agencies look for good sites that can offset impacts.
And actually, that was going to be my follow-up is, we've talked about white paper being very, kind of concise and to the point, but we've also talked about having additional resources. And one of those resources in my mind could be some kind of online portal where we pull together the variety of, Devlin pulled up the GIS information that's available at BLM. David just mentioned this specific tool, and there's more out there. And so I feel like if we could make some kind of universal collection point where people could go, because otherwise, and I think the same problem plagues every conversation we have. Everybody's doing lots of complementary things, but how to get all those people together to share information and resources is not always easy. So I don't know how we're going to do that, because that sounds like money and stuff that the stakeholder group doesn't have right now. But I feel like that's part of the solution is just having some kind of online portal that we can help people find those resources and contacts. Every agency is a little different. Like if you want to talk to the Forest Service right now, Jonas is the best person because they're operating very differently at the local level, and you really need to get to the right person first, and then they can help you navigate. Whereas in other cases, Devlin was mentioning, they have kind of a mitigation lead for each region, so that's a bit more structured, and it's going to be so different for everybody. So the easier we can make it on the front end, I think the better.
Is it working? Yes. So we have a question from the audience online. Is Sarah wondering, she had a bank sponsor propose removing culverts along a logging road on public lands, but they could not secure the logging rights, so it was possible that the logging company could come back in and reestablish the logging road within the next 15 years. So she wants to know what your thoughts are on that, David.
I see it has potential. Again, that would be a local decision made by the core district of whether that, let's just say 50 years was sufficient. Again, we don't specify in our rules how long is long term, but we have to also take into account that we live in a rapidly changing environment, and again, one of the reasons why we didn't use perpetuity in the rule was because, again, nothing lasts forever, and we're dealing with dynamic systems. But if the district's comfortable with assurances that for 50 years that those reopened areas are going to stay reopened, it has potential.
David, I'm wondering, one of the things actually you talked about was the management of compatible versus incompatible
Right.
uses. So I wonder if an example like that could maybe fall under that category, where if the use changes, that there's funding set aside. Maybe long-term management looks different in areas where potentially incompatible use could come in the future, and that
Right.
there's, and Devlin said the same thing. If BLM has a substantial land use change, that they would have to identify an area to offset whatever the loss is associated with that. So once again, I think we want to be cautious about the in perpetuity. So what's a reasonable amount of time they could guarantee? But if for some reason that timeline was shortened, maybe there's some kind of financial assurance that could be there. Curious.
Again, financial assurances aren't going to be there forever necessarily. True. But again, if the time frame identified was 50 years and the district said that's acceptable, and if something unforeseen happened where it was only 10 years, then BLM would likely be responsible for providing compensation to make up for what was lost as a result of that incompatible use. So that flexibility remains there. But again, I would offer that we shouldn't be disregarding good projects that are going to benefit the environment simply because we don't know what's going to happen in 50 years. I mean, we have short careers. Generally they last 20 years, maybe 30 years if you're lucky. And then with the Corps, there's more projects coming in. It's like, how do you keep up with all this? So we do the best we can, but it's a fact of life is that something that happened 50 years ago, you're not going to really give a lot of attention to because you're focused on what's happening now, because that's what your boss is saying you got to get done.
Right.
So let's not get too hung up in how long is long term, because a lot of things can happen in those intervening years.
And, you know, having you and Michelle here and some of the other kind of leads within the Corps, how does your group, how do you as individuals engage with the different districts that, is there a trickle down effect of that philosophy, or is there a way of, that's one of the questions that people talk a lot about.
I mean, I'll just say as general matter is that one of the concerns we hear about the Corps is inconsistency. So we have a diverse workforce. We have about 1,200 regulators. A lot of them have different viewpoints on various things, and so, you know, people are going to see different things differently, apply things differently. That's just the nature of the program and nature of being human. So yeah. There are no, I'd like to say, there's no absolutes in our program. There's different viewpoints and different approaches. Approaches may also vary by region, not just by project manager. So it's one of the things that we struggle with, but I think a lot of agencies struggle with the same thing. Oh yeah, no, yes, I shouldn't say that it's not specific to the Corps question, but I know that when you make that statement and some of the other statements that, you know, in general that we've talked about while we're at this conference, that's a common question that you then hear, you know, talked about at lunch afterwards. So I wanted to pose that. Other Corps staff have other views. If other people have other views, you know, please speak up. Yeah. So we have 2 minutes and 45 seconds. That giant clock down there tells me. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, yeah, Sarah. Oh.
So I know Kevin Noon didn't get to speak today. Just wondering if you guys know of any updates on the National Park Service's efforts on public lands. I know they were working on the degraded wetlands inventory. Yeah. And if you have any idea how that's going, if it's, because that might get to the gentleman's question in the front. I think that seems like a real great tool. Yeah. Once that does come out, it will show where they have degraded wetlands on their National Park Service lands. So. Yeah. So I'm going to give almost a I don't know answer, but with just a little bit of, when talking with Kevin, he continues to sound very engaged and passionate on the topic and sounded like he's making strong headways. Because the change in his participation happened really fast, I couldn't get those exact details to be able to share, but I am hoping to have him talk again, and I might actually just invite him to the working group conversation, because one of the things I wanted, you know, in particular for him on Monday, but today was going to be the focus more on the actual documents. On Monday, he was going to speak and talk more about, you know, the concept of national parks, you know, lands and this concept of degraded systems. And, you know, he's like, oh, I'll show them a degraded wetland in the middle of Yellowstone. And, you know, so like he just to kind of continue to set that stage that even the best of the best, you know, needs help. But it sounded like things were moving forward at a pretty good pace. Like he was definitely focused on that conversation. So, I'm going to reach out to him after this conference and see about, I don't want to wait a year to get that feedback. So one, I can let you know directly, but then hopefully we can wrangle you to come. I'll invite him to talk at maybe the next stakeholder call, and we can have some extra people join.
And if I could just say something before we all leave. Yeah, I'm really sorry I couldn't be there in person with you this year, but I will be there in Boise next year, and I hope to see you there, and we can talk more, you know, more specifically about some of these issues. So, you know, I think my talk was extremely general, high level, but definitely want to talk more about specific processes and tools and things that can help you get a successful compensatory mitigation project sited on BLM managed land. So nice. With that, thanks.
Thank you, Devlin. We literally hit the 0 mark right with that. Thanks. Devlin, thank you so much for joining and doing this virtually. It's been great to have you on multiple sessions. So thanks for, it's much earlier in Colorado, so I imagine you were waking up early to get on, so I appreciate that.
Thanks, awesome. Lindsay. It's great to see you all.
You as well. And thank you guys for joining us. And, you know, we're hoping to continue the conversation in all ways.
Thank you.